Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 12th of September 2022. The articles which we are going to take up have been displayed on the screen, and let us now begin the discussion.
So the first article which we have taken has appeared on text and context page. The Indira Gandhi Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme in Rajasthan. How is this initiative different from Manrega for villagers? What are some of the similar schemes being implemented in other states? And so the Rajasthan government has rolled out this new initiative with the objective of providing economic support to the poor and needy families living in the cities through work to be provided on demand for 100 days in a year. And so this particular article dwells into the features of this specific scheme. But as all of us know that UPSC rarely asks about unique initiatives by the state governments, but rather it is mostly concerned about the initiatives taken by the central government. And especially if you look into the GS paper 1, you have a line in the syllabus which says urbanization, their problems and their remedies. The increasing rapid rate of urbanization in our country is leading to creation of massive urban mega cities. Since the demand for the space within the cities is too much and supply is not able to match that demand, which is leading to the creation of urban slums. Poor people from rural areas, hinterland migrating to urban mega cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad, Bangalore, creating massive pressures on urban infrastructure. And so you have a significant population living below the poverty line, below the urban poverty line, which are categorized as urban poor. Also, if you look into the GS paper 2 syllabus, you have a line in the syllabus which says issues related to poverty and hunger. And so, of course, if you talk about segregation of poverty on the basis of rural and urban, this could also form a part of GS paper 2 syllabus. And hence, we are first going to understand what urban poverty is and what are the various kinds of vulnerabilities an urban poor is exposed to, especially with terms of housing, economic vulnerabilities, social and personal vulnerabilities. Then what are the ways through which we can resolve the urban poverty, and is there really a need for National Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme? And so let us now begin Now whenever we start a discussion on a key term, it is always a good idea to first understand that particular key term, and in this respect you can clearly see two words written on your screen, urban and poverty, which basically means a group of people who are considered to be poor and are located in urban areas in our country. And so although the definition of poverty has always been subjective, but we have two quantifications of poverty in our country. And as you can see on the screen, these two estimates were Tendulkar Committee and Rangarajan Committee. They decided both rural as well as urban poverty line. And so as you can see on the screen, while Tendulkar Committee designated urban poverty line as rupees 1000 per capita per month at 2011 and 12 prices, Rangarajan Committee estimated it to be 1407 rupees per month per household. So if a household was earning 1407 rupees in 2011-12, they would not be considered as poor. But all those people who were earning less than on a family basis, they would be considered as urban poor. Now let's take up the best case demonstration of a family household earning more than 1407 rupees per month. Even in 2011 and 12, this was a very small sum, especially if the family has 3 or 4 people. And so you can clearly see that if a family is poor in urban area, they are exposed to a lot of vulnerabilities. They are exposed to housing vulnerabilities, they are exposed to economic, social as well as personal vulnerabilities. Now when we talk about housing vulnerability, because the income of the urban poor is on an average less than 1407 in 2011-12 prices, majority of urban poor generally live in low quality, unhygienic areas such as slums. They have no ownership rights and entitlements. And as occupants construct on empty land, the civic body does not provide them basic amenities. and therefore they have no access to individual water connections, toilets, electricity, and even proper roads. Also, poor live in unhealthy and insanitary living conditions. And so, according to 2011 census, around 17.7% of the urban population, comprising 65 million people, lived in slums. But the vulnerabilities of the urban poor does not end just at housing problem. It is extended to economic situation also, because specifically because a household level, if the person is earning less than 1400 rupees, and if you inflation index this amount, it comes out to be 2.5 thousand rupees, which is just a paltry sum in 2021 and 22. Since most of the poor in urban areas are employed in informal unorganized sectors, not only their wages are low, but also they are employed irregularly, because they do not have the security which people from formal sector have. And so these irregular employment combined with low wages makes them even more vulnerable. This restricts availability of formal credit from banks, and with no access to formal safety net programs, they have barely any access to safety net programs and productive assets. But apart from housing and economic, urban poor is subjected to a lot of social vulnerabilities as well, because the income inequality creates divergence between lower strata of the society, that is poor, and the middle class. It then increases the social differences or divergence, as we've talked about, among various groups. So poor and middle class will increasingly grow different in terms of educational attainment, skill qualifications, and various other parameters, which then creates two socially very divergent groups living side by side, which is not a healthy thing for any city. And then finally, of course, the vulnerability is extended to the personal sphere as well. At personal level, poor are more vulnerable for getting social justice in their day-to-day work. The poor are victims of all types of injustice and violence, and particularly low caste people, minority, women, children, elderly, disabled, destitutes, people belonging to LGTB community. And since there are multi-dimensional vulnerabilities associated with urban poor, we obviously have a lot of government schemes to address each and every aspect of this vulnerability. So for example, to solve the problem of housing, the government of India runs Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, and that has an urban component, correct? Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation is the nodal agency to implement this scheme. In order to address the economic vulnerabilities of the urban poor, the Mahupa is implementing a centrally sponsored scheme by the name of Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana National Urban Livelihood Mission for reducing the poverty and vulnerability of the urban poor since 2013. And the mission covers all the statutory towns. Also, you have various miscellaneous acts, for example, Street Vendors Protection of Livelihood and Regulation of Street Vending Act 2014, which aims to protect the rights of urban street vendors and to regulate street vending activities. In order to address the social vulnerabilities, Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Jyoti Bima Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Suraksha Bima Yojana, Atal Pension Yojana seek to bring unorganized sector workers and poor across the country under the safety net of insurance and pension. And so you can clearly see that the kind of vulnerabilities we have identified, for most of them, the government is definitely running programs to alleviate. Now, in order to tackle urban poverty convincingly, we first have to understand that there is a need to build credible database of urban poor and migrants, along with mapping their skills, that will be maintained centrally at the district level. And so you can say that National Migrant Database, which has been initiated by National Disaster Management Authority, is definitely a step in the right direction. But apart from that, we will have to reform the urban governance. And so we will have to rebuild urban governance model on the pillars of convergence and accountability, urban population specific central sector schemes, wider public participation, and use of latest technology. Apart from this, the reforms of funds, functions, and functionaries will have to be fulfilled, And we need to devolve a lot of financial and administrative authority and autonomy to the local level in order for them to be effective. At the same time, we also need to emphasize the decentralization of urban growth, because urban planning should be decentralized by focusing on smaller cities. This will lessen the burden of migrant population on mega cities and will also enhance the livability within the cities. And then finally, there is a need to address the vulnerabilities which we have talked about. And that is why the need of the hour is National Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is what the Rajasthan government has initiated. And so just like you have Manrega, which is the Rural Employment Guarantee Schemes, this can be conceptualized as Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme. Guaranteed employment to all the poor in urban areas, which will then be reflected in raised incomes, because UEGP would help to address the underemployment and low wages in informal and urban workforce by mandating a statutory wage. So for example, it will be mentioned, or it should be mentioned in the legislation, that minimum 100 or 150 days of employment will be provided to all those people who register themselves on the portal. An urban employment guarantee scheme is going to create assets just like it has created in rural areas. A centrally funded program covering the wages of different kinds of workers will allow the urban local bodies to invest in asset creation to improve the quality of life of urban populations. They can also generate new sets of green jobs that can strengthen the capacity of ULBs as well as promote sustainable urban development. And then of course it is going to create better trained workforce, because just like you had Manrega for unskilled workers, because you had those kinds of jobs of pond creation, road maintenance and everything. But in urban areas, if a program will have to be urban employment guarantee, it cannot be unskilled. It has to have a skill component. And so it is going to result into better trained workforce. The next article for discussion appears on page number 7, State of Play, Greyhounds in Search of Home. It has taken far too long for the state to set up a base and training center for the force in Andhra. So Greyhound, the elite anti-Maoist force and a role model for all left-wing extremism affected states after the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh in 2014, is not going through a good patch. Now, if you have a look at GS3 syllabus, under it, there is a line which says linkages between development and spread of extremism. Now, the matters related to law and order and internal security are looked after by Ministry of Home Affairs, and it publishes an annual report every year. And this is a screenshot from the 2019, which is the latest report of MHA. And let us just look at the first paragraph of the report. It says, internal security issues in the country can broadly be categorized as follows: terrorism in the hinterland of the country, left-wing extremism in certain areas, security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and insurgency in the northeastern states. So when UPSC expects you to be aware about the internal security challenges, these are the 4 internal security challenges which you should prepare for the mains examination. And of course, left-wing extremism appears prominently over there. UPSC has asked question both in 2015 as well as in 2018. In 2015, UPSC had asked, the persisting drives of the government for development of large industries in backward areas have resulted in isolating the tribal population and the farmers who face multiple displacements with Malkamgiri and Naxalbari foci. Discuss the corrective strategies needed to win the left-wing extremism doctrine affected citizens back into the mainstream of social and economic growth. In 2018, UPSC asked, left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend, but still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE. And so keeping in mind these past year question paper as well as the syllabus, we are going to first understand what Naxalism actually is, what is its ideology, how due to the government deficit, due to various issues related to the constitutional and legal measures, it spread in so many states and districts in our country. And finally, since last 10 years, we are seeing a decline or a downfall in left-wing extremism threat. And so what government has done right in order to achieve this reduction in Naxalite activity in the central regions of our country. So let us now begin the discussion. Starting with understanding what Naxalism actually is. So, Naxalism is a far left violent movement which aims to overthrow the government of India through people's war. So, it basically wants to replace the Indian state through a violent and a guerrilla movement. According to the recent MHA release, it is currently impacting more than 80 districts scattered around 11 states in our country. So you can easily understand how widespread the spread of Naxalism is, although it has decreased through time, but it is still prevalent in many areas. If we talk about Naxalism, from where does this word comes from? It comes from a village known by the name of Naxalbari in Darjeeling district of West Bengal. Because this whole movement is derived from there. Because in 1967, peasant revolt against landlords in Naxalbari village in Darjeeling district of West Bengal went out of control and police opened fire on them. And there began this violent movement, which actually claims to base its ideology on three important people. First is Marx and Engels, and the second is Mao Zedong. Now, if we talk about left or far left movement, most of them derive their ideology from the same set of people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So what was their actual ideology? So according to them, all social relations and state structures in an elitist or a capitalist society are quite exploitative in nature. And since they are exploitative in nature, they need to be replaced. And so according to Naxals, the current Indian state is based on similar capitalistic or semi-feudal setup. And so it needs to be replaced. But there are various ways of replacing a government or a state, but they talk about a revolution. Only a revolution can change this exploitative setup. And so, whoever bases his or her ideology on Marx believes that only a revolutionary change through active means can end this. And that means is provided by Mao Zedong, who led the revolution of Communist Party in China, because he gave the concept of guerrilla warfare, protracted people's war, a war led by the common people against the state, the war not in democratic sense, but war which is violent in nature, which includes surrounding the cities from countryside, political transformation through mass involvement, and finally, through these measures, overthrow the state. And so Naxalites base their ideology on these two things. And so whenever you read news articles related to some Naxalite activity, they basically deal with attack on prominent political leaders, paramilitary forces and police personnel because they want to overthrow the Indian state. But what is the reality of Naxalites? If you look at their overall activity, it seems to be that they are working against the interests of the people they claim to defend. They want to perpetuate their power in jungles through fear psychosis. They attack civilians and personnel from CAPF or Central Armed Police Forces. They carry out regular extortions, not just from the local people but also from industrialists. So although they claim to base their ideology on Marx and against capitalism, but they let the industries thrive as long as they agree to pay protection or extortion money. And so the question arises that under the constitutional and legal framework of India, which is considered to be one of the most democratic setup, how come an ideology like Naxalite not only emerged but spread into such a vast territory in our country, as you can see on the diagram in front of your screen? At its peak, it impacted so many districts and states in our country. An answer to that lies in government deficit, the inability or inefficiency of the government to cater to the needs and demands of the people, especially the tribal people, created a fertile ground for this kind of ideology, which ultimately engulfed a major region in our central parts of country. And let us understand those reasons one by one. But basically, they can be categorized into four main reasons. Starting with lack of proper land reforms, lack of proper implementation of the provisions provided in the 5th schedule of our constitution, lack of forest rights being given to the tribal people, and atrocities being committed against people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Let us discuss them one by one. We know that the Constitution of India has created the provisions of the 5th schedule, which provide for alternate or special governance mechanism for certain scheduled areas in the mainland of our country. And in the 5th schedule, various special provisions have been provided for these specified scheduled areas, which among various other things include the constitution of Tribal Advisory Council in the states. And it also provides for some special powers being given to governor with respect to the legislations. Now this provision was created in order to protect the tribals in various states. But what has happened? What has happened is that there is a widespread nepotism in the way tribal advisory councils have been constituted. Although initially it was expected that for formulating any policies with respect to the tribals, the advice of tribal advisory council shall be taken. But what happens is that since the influence of council of ministers is so immense that it creates problem at governor and tribal advisory council interface. And more often than not, the tribal advisory council, when it is constituted, it is not a true representative of the tribal population of the state. And apart from that, there is a lack of clarity over the discretionary power of the governor. We know that according to the Constitution of India, the governor is to act on aid and advice of Council of Ministers. But according to the provisions of the 5th schedule, governor can act on its own when it comes to the matters related to the scheduled areas. And so this has led to a lot of confusion, and in essence, the true purpose for which the provisions of the 5th schedule were constituted have not been realized. Then comes the matter of forest rights. We know that most of the tribals in our country reside in forested regions. And it is one of the main reasons for the spread of Naxalism as well. Because since the time of the Britishers, we have started to encroach on forested areas. It started with the British government. The monopolization of forests started with the enactment of various forest laws enacted in order to protect the forest. But in the process, we forgot that forest does not just includes the trees and the animals, but also includes people. And since the protection of environment and nature took precedence over the development of the people, there was no Forest Right Acts until 2006, when the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006 was legislated. And through this act, the rights of forest dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers to forest resources and their rights were recognized for the first time. It was recognized that these communities live on forest, depend on forest, and it is very, very important to give them rights inside their own forests. But if you look at the provisions of FRA 2006, individual right status is decent, but there is minimal community rights, or community rights are not given. There is so much of insistence on evidence. For example, every tribal has to prove through an evidence that they are living in this forest traditionally, and only then their rights will be recognized. And we know that since time immemorial, they have been functioning outside the system which we have created ourselves. And so there is a lack of evidence which ultimately results in the delay or lack of recognition of the rights provided in Forest Right Act 2006, which ultimately brews the frustration. Then there are atrocities being committed on scheduled caste and scheduled tribal people. We know that there is an act known by the name of Prevention of Atrocities Against SC and ST Act, but it was again legislated in 1989, but by then this problem had already grown. But even if you look at the implementation of this particular act, it lies in the hands of police officials, which again harbor caste prejudices. Ultimately, people sitting in most powerful positions in the bureaucracy and police also have the same caste biases which this particular act tries to fight. And so, the implementation of this particular act, especially in forested regions, has not been great. And then finally, the lack of land reforms. We know that widespread land reforms were carried out after independence, and it has carried on in some states or the other since then. But the land reforms were successful only in few states, for example in Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala and West Bengal. And due to the lack of the political will, most of the steps categorized under land reforms were either not implemented, or if they were implemented, they were not efficient or effective. And so that left the Indian society, especially in these regions, with a lot of landless people. So they don't have their own forests, they don't have land outside the forest, and so it became quite a fertile ground for an extremist ideology like Naxalism. So what is the current status of left-wing extremism and the activities related to it? So if you look at the data from 2001 to 2018, you can see that there is a persistent decline in the left-wing extremism incidents, which means the attacks being carried out by the Naxalites. As compared to more than 2200 incidents in 2010, it has come down to less than 800 cases in 2018, and this is the data given on the Ministry of Home Affairs. And so it clearly shows that there is some traction to the policies and the strategies being followed by the state governments and also the central governments. So all the states affected by LWE have taken their particular measures to suit their local requirements. But in this particular discussion, we are just going to discuss the approach of the central government and the steps taken by them. At the same time, it is important for you to understand that police and public order being the state subject, action with respect to maintenance of law and order lies primarily in the domain of the concerned state governments. Therefore, the policy of the Government of India is to effectively deal with the LWE insurgency primarily by capacity building of the state governments both in areas of security and development. So there is a clear-cut demarcation of the policy. The central government helps various state governments as far as security measures is concerned, and then it also helps the state governments in developing the areas on high priority which are impacted with LWE. So you can see that this is quite a holistic approach. And let us start by first understanding the security measures. First and foremost, outlawing the CPI Maoist, which is the major left-wing extremist organization responsible for most incidents of violence and casualties. And it has been included in the schedule of terrorist organization along with all its formations and front organization under the existing Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 or UAPA. Then, government is taking active measures to strengthen the intelligence mechanism because central government cannot directly police the areas, but it can provide the intelligence inputs to the states. And so in order to counter the growing challenge of LWE activities, several steps have been taken to strengthen and upgrade the capabilities of intelligence agencies both at the center as well as the state level. This includes intelligence sharing through Multi-Agency Center (MAC) at the central level and State Multi-Agency Center at the state level 24/7 basis. These centers enable state and all India level coordination among various agencies involved in countering the LWE. Other steps which have been taken to strengthen the intelligence mechanism include setting up of Joint Command and Control Center at Gaya and at Jagdalpur, which will act as nodal centers to coordinate operation against the CPIM or Naxalites. Then we know that Naxalites take special advantage of the fact that there are limitations in front of the state police, and as soon as you cross the border from one state to another and then from that state to another, you can easily evade the action. And so that is why interstate coordination is a must if you counter LWEs. If you look at the border areas of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Telangana, which is quite a hotbed for Naxalite activities, this is the main reason. Not only these areas are densely forested, but they also belong to different jurisdictions. And you know that police of one state cannot automatically pursue a criminal in another. And so, taking advantage of this fact, they keep on moving from one state to another. And for this, Ministry of Home Affairs keeps on conducting regular and frequent interstate meetings of not only bureaucrats, police officials, but also the Chief Minister for enabling a better response to LWE. Then we know that majority of casualties to security forces in anti-LWE operations are caused by IEDs or improvised explosive devices. The Ministry of Home Affairs continues to support extensive counter-IED capacity building efforts of state police forces to enable them to timely identify the IEDs and defuse them. And for this purpose, regular training programs are conducted by MHA. Then MHA has created India Reserve or Specialized Indian Reserve Battalion, acronymed as SIRB. The LWE affected states have been sanctioned India Reserve Battalions mainly to strengthen security apparatus at their level and also to enable the states to provide gainful employment to youth, particularly in LWE affected areas. Then there are numerous schemes run by MHA which directly provide advantage to the local police. For example, sanctioning of funds for fortified police stations under the scheme of the same name and carrying out of Civic Action Program or CAP, under which financial grants are provided to CAPFs to undertake various welfare activities in LWE affected areas. And the idea is that CRPF will go to an area, cleanse it from Maoists, keep it free from Maoists, and then develop that area using the same funds. So these are the measures dealing with the security issue. But if we don't develop these areas, these gains will be temporary. And to make these gains permanent, there is a need to develop them as well. And for that also, a lot of schemes are carried out. But in this case, not all schemes are carried out by Ministry of Home Affairs. Now in the beginning we discussed how the acts dealing with the conservation of the forest and the nature created the main problem. And so the Regulation of Forest Conservation Act 1980 have been eased in these areas. And now it is allowed to divert the forest land for infrastructure creation dealing with the activities mentioned in the schedule. For example, construction of schools, colleges, telecommunication lines, drinking water projects, irrigation projects, creation of roads. For all these activities, the limits up to which a forest land can be diverted has been increased drastically to enable the development of these regions. Then, lack of connectivity is the major tool in the hands of Naxalites. They first disconnect the local population from the mainland and then they carry out their brainwashing. And so connectivity has been a major plank of the government of India. And the connectivity does not mean road connectivity only, but it also means communications connectivity. And so the government of India has been implementing road requirement plan and road connectivity project for LWE areas. Also, installation of mobile towers has been on high priority of the government in these regions. Then we talked about how the lack of implementation of the provisions of the Forest Rights Act has created a lot of trouble in these regions. Now government is keeping the timely distribution of the titles or the land titles to the tribals on high priority in LWE areas. According to the recent data by MHA, around 15 lakh titles have been distributed so far, which means that so many people have got the legitimate right to reside inside the forested region. Then we know that various schemes of the government of India, for example, skill development, which is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and many other schemes dealing with the rural development have a special focus on LWE areas. Similarly, Ministry of Education keeps LWE areas on high priority. For example, recently 7 new Kendriya Vidyalayas and 6 new Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas have been opened in LWE affected areas. And you'll be surprised to know that out of these, 2 new Kendriya Vidyalayas are to be opened in Gadchiroli and Kondagaon, which are the epicenter of Naxalism. So this is as far as the steps taken by the central government. But there are various unique schemes being run by various state governments. There are some unique surrender policies being run by various state governments, which has led to rapid increase in the surrender by the Naxalites. Similarly, there are some dedicated police force being created to counter LWE. And so let us know in the comment section what can be some important case studies to be cited while writing an answer in the mains examination. So this discussion is very pertinent from the perspective of GS3 mains examination. And this discussion we understood the idea behind Naxalism, how it originated, what were the deficits in our legal framework which actually gave rise to the Naxalism, and then finally what has been the government approach to counter left-wing extremism. Let us now move on to the next news.
So the next article which we have taken is food prices may affect August inflation. So cooling food prices may have helped moderate retail inflation to a 5-month low of 6.7% in July. But there could be a reversal in August inflation thanks to concerns about uneven progression of the monsoon through the country and other factors. Now, inflation is one of the very important determinants of economic growth, and not just economic growth, but the growth of UPSC aspirants as well, because just look at this instance from 2020 prelims examination where UPSC asks, consider the following statements. Statement 1, the weightage of food in consumer price index CPI is higher than that in wholesale price index known as WPI. Statement 2, the WPI does not capture changes in the prices of services which CPI does. Statement 3, Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Which of the statement given above are correct?
And now you can easily understand how inflation becomes important for UPSC, especially the prelims stage as well. And let me assure you that this is not very easy question. It requires you to have a clear-cut understanding of CPI, WPI and how they are different. And so we will begin with that comparison, and then we will go on and understand how we calculate inflation, and then what are the factors which are driving the current inflation rate in our country. So WPI is measure of inflation at the wholesale level, whereas CPI is the measure of inflation at the retail level. So you know that buyers exist both at the consumer level, which we form important part, because we don't go to the wholesale market for vegetables. We go to the local retailer or the grocery shop. Whereas the business people, the people who are involved in business, have to go to the wholesale market. And so the markets exist at two levels, and hence the inflation exists for these two different markets. And so that is why the calculation of WPI is done by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, because that is not something which is impacting the consumer directly. Of course, indirectly it does. But that is an easy way to remember who calculates WPI, because it is for wholesale market, and so Commerce and Industry Ministry is the one concerned with it. Whereas the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by National Statistical Office or NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For both of them, the base year is 2011-12 and 2012. Now, the basket of goods under the WPI is different from basket of CPI. Because under WPI, you have primary articles, manufactured products, and fuel and power. And highest weightage is given to manufactured products. Whereas if you look at CPI, the one which is consumed or centered around consumers, consists of what we consumes or what we spend maximum on, which is food and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous, which includes services of education and healthcare, and transportation, which is also a service. But the highest weightage is given to food and beverages. So on an average, an Indian household has the maximum expenditure on food and beverages, and that is why highest weightage has been given in the CPI to this particular category. Now, when the food prices increase, which is what is happening now, will it impact WPI the same way as it does CPI? Of course no, because you can see that the highest weightage is given to manufactured product, and so the impact of increase in food items is less on WPI as compared to CPI, since the WPI provides higher weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. Whereas the impact of increase in food items would be much wider on CPI because it has the highest weightage of foodstuffs. Now, as you can clearly see, there is no health, education and transportation here, and so under WPI, there is no service sector which is included, but it forms an important part of the CPI. Under WPI, there is no inclusion of taxes, whereas CPI has the inclusion of taxes. Now, we know that RBI has been given a mandate to maintain the inflation rate between 2 to 6% or 4% plus minus 2%. Now, what is this value, whether it is WPI or CPI? Now, the government does not want the average consumer to face the inflation at a very high rate. And so it makes sense that RBI is required to maintain CPI rate of inflation of 4% with a deviation of 2%, whereas RBI does not take into account WPI. So RBI targets inflation rate, which is CPI. And so let us now go back to the prelims 2020 question and try to solve it. The weightage of food in consumer price index is higher than that in WPI, which is correct. We have seen that. WPI does not capture changes in prices of services, which CPI does, which is also correct. RBI has now adopted WPI. No, this is wrong, because RBI has adopted CPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rate. And so the statement 1 and 2 are correct, leading us to the right answer A. And so often students ask about the base effect. What is this base effect? Now, to understand the base effect, we'll have to go through some calculations. You know that rate of inflation in current year depends on the rate of inflation in the previous year, because the rate of inflation is equal to prices in the current month minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by prices in the corresponding month of previous year into 100. And so, if the prices were very, very high in the same month last year, which means that denominator would have high value, and so you will have low rate of inflation because of base effect. Similarly, if the prices were very low, unusually low in the same month last year, your denominator will be low and hence your rate of inflation will be high because of the base effect. And so let us understand these two scenarios. Under scenario 1, let's say the price of an item A in 2019 May is 100 rupees, and in May 2020 it is 150 rupees, and in May 2021 they have increased to 200 rupees. So how are you going to calculate the inflation? For the first year, inflation would be calculated for May 2020. It would be done in a way by applying this formula. Prices in current month, which is 150, minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year, which is 100, divided by prices in corresponding month of the previous year, divided by 100, which is 50 by 100, which is 50% inflation. And similarly, if you apply the same formula, it comes out to be 33.33%, because then you are going to subtract 150 from 200 and divide it by 150 into 100. Again, to show you how the base effect changes the whole game, you have the same starting point and the same ending point, but the middle point is different. So let's say for an item B, it starts at 100 just like item A, but in May 2020 it was 110. So rate of inflation was 10%. In May 2021, the prices have gone up to 200, just as the way item A has gone. But item A has 33.33% inflation rate, whereas item B has 81.81% inflation rate, just owing to the base effect, because the base would be 110 in this case and 150 in this case. And so this is what is known as base effect. And so let us now quickly understand the reasons behind the inflation in our country right now. And there are 4 reasons behind that. Imported inflation, increase in certain food items prices, increase in services prices, and low base effect, which we just understood. So increase in global commodity prices such as crude oil, edible oil, all of us are feeling this particular instance of higher crude prices. And so since most of the things are being transported on crude oil, and so of course the increase in the prices of petrol and diesel would be reflected in everything else. Similarly, there are certain food items which are getting expensive, for example eggs, edible oils, fruits and pulses. Similarly, the prices of health, transport and communication sector services have gone up, and we know that services are included in CPI. And due to lockdown last year, the prices of most of the goods had declined because of the low demand. And so that is why we have low base effect, which would reflect in higher inflation prices. Also at the same time, aspirants often come across such terms such as headline and core inflation. Now, headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or even the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. So that is complete CPI and WPI. But on the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories, such as food, fuel, in order to measure the increase in the prices of goods and services in general. So you know that due to various reasons, some or the other component of CPI and WPI would deviate from the general trend. So for example, if the rate of inflation in general is low, but for let's say sudden reduction in rainfall, the prices of vegetables shoot up. But that is quite temporary, but that will take up the overall inflation trend high in that particular month. But that is not what is the general trend, and that general trend is called the core inflation. And so a drastic fall in the food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation by a large extent. However, the core inflation may remain unaffected. So don't get confused. RBI right now is targeting CPI headline rate of inflation, which is the complete CPI and not the core inflation. Now, a debate which has cropped up in last 2 years is that what should be actually targeted by RBI, whether it is headline, which is what is RBI doing right now, or should it resort to targeting the core inflation, because which is what is the normal trend. And so in this regard, Economic Survey has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on account of number of reasons. And accordingly, it has recommended that a greater focus on core inflation is warranted because of 4 specific reasons. First, headline inflation may take place due to volatility in prices of crude oil and food commodities over which RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks usually lead to increase in food prices. And accordingly, RBI changes its monetary policy, which is going to have no impact on this particular inflation. Similarly, increase in crude oil prices, the import of crude oil prices is not connected with the monetary policy of RBI. But RBI is changing its monetary policy as a result of these increase in prices. Then second, most of the time inflation in food commodities is transitory and may not require any policy change by RBI. It could be just a 1 month phenomena. But RBI comes up with a policy for 3 months, and so that could not be justified. Third, if the RBI tries to control inflation due to volatility in prices of food commodities, it can prove to be counterproductive. For example, to control inflation, rate of interest would increase, which will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which will result in economic slowdown. And lastly, to measure inflation correctly, weightage must be assigned to different categories of commodities depending upon their share in the household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. And the share of food commodities in household expenditure has declined since 2011-12. Yet the CPI gives a weightage of around 45% to food commodities, as we have already seen. So I hope with this discussion, it was clear to you as to what the inflation, especially the WPI and CPI differences, headline and core differences, and how the base effect impacts the rate of inflation. Let us now move on to the question of the day. Adopted TB patient drive finds Mitras. So the Union Health Ministry has introduced Adopt a TB Patient Initiatives, which is probably one of its kind in the world. The program was brought in to fill the critical community element into India's fight towards eliminating TB by 2025 under the Pradhan Mantri TB Mukt Bharat Abhiyan. Now, from the perspective of prelims examination, diseases are very, very important. For example, this question in 2019, which one of the following statements is not correct? So here, reading a question is also very, very important because a lot of students got it wrong because they clearly did not read not before the correct. And so you have to basically identify incorrect statement. So statement A was hepatitis B virus is transmitted much like HIV. So hepatitis B is a viral infection and it is transmitted through contact with blood or other bodily fluids of an infected person, which means that this statement is correct. And so it cannot be the right answer. Statement B read, hepatitis B, unlike C, does not have a vaccine. And this was the reason why the question was asked. And so this was the right answer because hepatitis B has a vaccine, which is also a mainstay of fight against this particular disease. Then statement C, globally, the number of people infected with hepatitis B and C viruses are several times more than those infected with HIV, which is also correct and hence cannot be the right answer because you have to identify the incorrect statement. And similarly, statement D was also correct because some of those infected with hepatitis B and C viruses do not show symptoms for many years, just like HIV. And so now you can understand that to be able to answer a standard difficult question in prelims examination, you will have to understand the disease and not all the diseases. But clearly, tuberculosis is of course one of those diseases which you are expected to know, which is an airborne communicable disease caused by bacteria Bacillus mycobacterium tuberculosis. So this bacteria is airborne, which means it can be transmitted through coughing just like COVID, and typically they grow in body where oxygen and blood are in high amount. And so obviously 80% of the TB cases are pulmonary, or those cases which infect the lung of people, whereas 20% of the cases also infect brain, uterus, stomach, mouth, kidney, bones, and these are called extrapulmonary TB. So from the first two paragraphs of this discussion, what we can infer is that TB is caused by a bacteria and it is airborne, and it just does not infect the lungs but other organs of the body as well. But these cases are very low, and so that is why we consider TB as something to do with lungs always. The mode of transmission is of course airborne, mainly through coughing, sneezing and spitting. And not all people are equally vulnerable to this disease. Just like most other infectious disease, people with immune compromised situation like HIV, undernutrition, diabetic, people who do smoking and high alcohol consumption are more vulnerable to TB than others. As far as prevention is concerned, BCG vaccine for children have proven to be very, very effective, but there is no effective vaccine for adults, and that is the main problem in our fight against TB. As far as diagnosis is concerned, early diagnosis is extremely important in fighting TB, and sputum microscopy, which studies the bacteria under the microscope, is one of the very effective way of diagnosis. So what is the current status of TB in our country? India tops the list of 20 TB high burden countries in the world. According to WHO's Global TB 2019, out of 10 million global TB incidences, around 27%, or you can say roughly 1/3 of the cases across the world, occur in our country. Not just that, once they occur, we are not able to prevent the prognosis of the disease, which results in around 200 people dying per lakh population, which is very, very high. It's not like government has not done anything. There was National TB Control Program, which is ongoing since 1962. Then it was revised in 1997 when the government of India adopted revised National TB Control Program, under which directly observed treatment short course was initiated. And recently in 2017, we have National Strategic Plan for TB Elimination. It aims to eliminate TB by 2025, which works on 4 pillars: detect, treat, prevent, and build. The specific targets have been set with the base year of 2015. So by 2025, we should have reduced the incidence of TB by 80%, mortality by 90%, and 0% patient having catastrophic expenditure due to TB. So this is how India is trying to manage the epidemic of TB. So BCG, or Bacillus calmette-guerin, is named after its inventors Albert Calmette and Camille Guerin. In countries where TB or leprosy is common, 1 dose is recommended in healthy babies as soon as possible after their birth. Whereas in areas where TB is not common, only children at high risk are typically immunized. Adults who do not have TB and have not been previously immunized but are frequently exposed may be immunized as well, but the efficacy of vaccine on those people are not clearly understood. So what actually is contained in the vaccine? So vaccine is prepared from a different strain of bacteria, not the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but Mycobacterium bovi, which has lost its ability to cause disease in humans because this is a TB bacteria which is modified itself to infect bovines or cattle. Because the living bacteria evolved to make the best use of available nutrients, they become less well adapted to human blood and can no longer induce disease when introduced into human caused. But still they are quite similar with the actual TB bacteria because of their common ancestry, and they are sufficient to provide certain degree of immunity, especially in case of children. So instead of directly using TB bacteria, you use a closely related bacteria which cannot infect humans but is more than sufficient to induce the immunity which is required to actually prevent the disease in most number of cases in children. So Ukraine is trying to push back Russian forces in the south while Russian troops continue to advance in the east. So Ukraine's military says it has broken through Russia's first line of defense in occupied Kherson region. Russian forces are continuing efforts to make advances in Donetsk region, which has been plotted with yellow color on the map of Ukraine towards the east. And as you can see, both Luhansk as well as Donetsk region over there. You can see Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, right there. And if you talk about the countries which surround Ukraine, you can see Romania, you can see Poland, Belarus, Russia. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see that Donetsk region and Luhansk region, half of which are controlled by Russian-backed separatists. When we talk about important locations within Ukraine, the important towns are Donetsk, Mariupol, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odisha, Crimea, Vinnytsia and Lviv. Dnieper River becomes important, which passes through Kyiv, cuts across Ukraine into 2 halves, as you can see on the screen. And so from the perspective of prelims examination, these map locations are very, very important.